So the next thing I want to talk about is figures of speech, where imagery gives us a very sort of physical, tangible world to connect to, even if it's an imaginary world, even if it's, fairies or dragons or space people. It's still something we can experience with our senses. Figurative language is sort of, it often deploys imagery, but it's not direct, right? It is evocative. Rather than simply describing something, which can be extremely satisfying in its own right to read a really awesome description full of juicy imagery. When the poet uses figurative language, they invite our participation of figuring out, if you will, of the content, right? It provides us with a depth of meaning and a richness in our engagement. And there are lots of ways that they can go about doing this, and there are tons and tons. In fact, that was figurative language. That was hyperbole. And also maybe an implied metaphor. Tons and tons of figurative language terms, because figurative language terms actually don't have any weight. So there's the implied metaphor that there's something tangible, and also hyperbole. Look at that, me using figurative language, not even realizing I'm doing it. Okay, but we're gonna move along. There are a lot of kinds of figurative languages. I have here, I keep looking down at this little list. It's a very short list. I think there's like maybe 5 things on it that I think are very useful for us. You don't need to know the exact terms as much as you need to tune in to how the poet is using figurative language, like metaphor, simile, synecdoche. I always say I hate that word. There's some city in New York. I always say that by mistake. Metonymy. You don't need to know them all, but you need to kind of tune into, wow, there's something going on there, and it's making me feel some kind of way. It's making me think some kind of thing. I'm gonna dig in there. I'm gonna hit that moment in the poem. I'm going to see what else I can pull out of it. How much deeper into the experience of this poem I can get. The big ones that we've been learning since, 3rd, 4th grade, maybe younger, maybe a little older, are simile and metaphor. And as you surely know, simile is a comparison of 2 unlike objects using a specific go-to word, like, as, appears, seems, something that lets us know that this is like that. And it's usually something you don't expect to be like that. Like the time during the end of the year break at the turn of each calendar year kind of feels a little like taffy, right? And I kind of feel like this whole plague time also feels a lot like taffy. It's like this stretchy time. Has it been a day? Has it been a week? I don't know. It's taffy time. It's very much like taffy. Though it could also be a metaphor, and I could just say, during this time, during this crazy taffy time, where the world just feels like challenging. It's hard to know when is what is when. It's taffy time, or it's time like taffy. But metaphors are more direct. They don't use like or as. So we get something like Shakespeare saying, all the world's a stage, and men and women are merely players. And then he has an entire extended metaphor explaining the stages of man at each age in their life. But all the world's a stage. All the world is not a stage. However, it works. You're like, oh, I'm perking up. Okay, what are the roles that I play? What kind of a role do I play? What kind of a role do other people play? And it kind of gives you a little more insight and gives you a little more depth of the experience in that particular speech. I'm going to flip my page. I'm not even going to try and do it. Implied metaphors, like I was talking about before when I said tons and tons, can be kind of sneaky, right? Because they'll attribute an attribute of a thing. They'll assign an attribute of something that is not this, that is unlike the thing they're describing. For example, she barked at the children to hurry up, right? They're not saying that girl is a dog, right? But there's this implied metaphor that she's being kind of a dog, right? Barking at the kids, right? An extended metaphor is when all or part of a poem uses a series of connected metaphors. And so when you start to look at the connections between those metaphors, you can pull more out of the poem. Actually, I'm just going to use a poem that I wrote, which I don't normally do, but I'm going to, in which all of the food items represent they aren't really food items. All of the things that the family is eating that aren't food represent different emotions. So the first stanza is like, on nights that we had gravel for dinner, Mama mixed it into our mashed potatoes, told us to swallow it like a pill, right? And then it's like, on nights that we had firecrackers for dinner, on nights that we had spiders for dinner, on nights that we had confetti for dinner. And so all, like, the gravel represents sadness. If you dig into it, you're like, oh, the gravel clearly represents sadness or grief, and the firecrackers clearly represent anger, and the spiders represent fear, and the confetti represents happiness. And it's just talking about eating your emotions, eating your feelings, right? So that would be an extended metaphor. A controlling metaphor is when the metaphor, it is the whole poem, right? So perhaps you write a poem about playing chess, or you read a poem about playing chess, but it is not actually a poem about playing chess. It is actually a poem about two people trying to have some sort of competition or settle something. Or there's a great poem, and I cannot remember the author, who writes about rowing. He writes about, like, two people on a canoe rowing. And if anyone has ever gone canoeing, he never in the whole poem mentions that the poem is actually about physical intimacy, right? It's a poem to his wife about rowing, and I can't find it. So if anybody finds it, send it to me, because it's great, and it's been years since I read it. But if anybody's ever gone canoeing with someone, you know that there's a way that you have to learn each other's movements and respond to each other's movements. It's a brilliant metaphor. So the whole poem is about rowing, but it's really not about rowing at all. It's actually kind of saucy. So you don't need to be able to actually distinguish one from the other, but it's really, really useful to understand how metaphors function, right? So that you can go, oh, pull it apart. What else is in there? First, let it wash over you. Just like the lecture about just how to read a poem first, just enjoy it. And then look for the Easter eggs and enjoy it a little more. Puns, we all know what puns are. Puns, interestingly, aren't just fun and games. Puns rely on words that sound alike, or words that have multiple meanings. and we all think about like, and of course I can't come up with a pun to save my life right now because I'm trying to do a lecture, but we think about, often puns are very punny, they're very funny. But I'm thinking of, and I keep defaulting to Shakespeare, but in King Lear, when Cordelia, his daughter, he basically just pisses Lear off. You can read it on your own time if you ever feel like it. And he's trying to split his kingdom up between the daughters, and the daughter's like, no, I'm not gonna fall. I want to just tell you the truth. I'm not gonna fluff you up with words. And when he like just decides she's worthless, and when he decides she's worthless, he uses all these terms saying that she's no longer tender, right? And he uses a lot of other economical terms when he talks about her, and that is also pun, right? And in no way funny. It's actually really sad. So sometimes look for that wordplay, look for those potential double meanings, and see what you can pull out of it. Puns are fascinating, and they're not always a chuckle. Sometimes they're a gut shot. Oh, look, a metaphor. Then there's synecdoche. I hate that word, but it's spelled SyneCdoche. Don't worry, it'll be in the subtitles and in a handout. But what that is essentially, synecdoche, is when a part signifies a whole. So when we like the term all hands on deck, right? People aren't just putting their hands on the deck. It's all like, it's the work. It's the hands represent the work, right? Or when someone is maybe signified as like their wagging tongue, like their gossip, right? Another word they're often confused for each other, but it doesn't really, like, as long as you can kind of recognize them, I'm not quizzing you on this, is metonymy. Metonymy is really neat because it takes something that is associated with, so closely associated with a thing, that it kind of becomes a symbol for or a stand-in for that thing. I keep putting my hand up here because the crown is an example, right? The crown is the head of state, is the king or queen, right? So the crown, rather than saying the king or the queen. Trying to think of another. There's so many examples of metonymy, and I, of course, anyway, hyperbole. We all know what that is. It's an exaggeration. Tons and tons and tons of figurative language. Paradox. So the last two, and we'll be done. Paradox is when something doesn't seem to make sense at first, but then it does, right? Like the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, if I was going into battle, I wouldn't go charging into battle, with a pen, but when you really want to change the world, right? It matters. The pen is mightier than the sword. There's a very famous writer, Tiango. He wrote a book and an essay called Decolonizing the Mind, and he talked about how the way to defeat people, the way the physical subjugation of a community was done by the gun, and but the spiritual subjugation of the community was done through language, taking away their language. So that also just speaks to the pen being mightier than the sword, right? It's just an example, and a sad one. Sorry to bring it down. And then an oxymoron is when you have two words that you use next to each other that seem to contradict each other. It's like a compressed paradox. And really creates in a poem a moment that will draw us in because of the tension between the words. And I'm going to go back to Shakespeare because he's my guy today, apparently. It's the only examples I'm coming up with. And that's like at the end of the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet, when they're like, well, say goodnight, goodnight, goodnight. Parting is such sweet sorrow. Sweet sorrow next to each other is oxymoronic. So those are a short list of figurative language terms. That was a short list of figurative language terms that hopefully will help you to find some more points of entry into the poems as we read them this week. Thank you for being amazing. I'll talk to you soon.